Solutions Network, and you heard our director on Wednesday giving the keynote address for this meeting. We're also working with Capri. Many of you would have heard of Capri, the Caribbean Policy Research Institute, which incidentally is located just on the other side of the parking lot here. And also CARICOM. Everybody who's heard of CARICOM? Yes, good. All right, what are we going to be talking about? Today is, or this particular session is about measuring progress and ways in which we can measure the progress that we need to measure in order to figure out, are we on the right track for achieving the goals? Are we spending our money correctly in terms of achieving the goals? Is this investment in this particular social problem likely to help solve us a problem somewhere else? How can we get to the goals as quickly as possible? I'm going to introduce our panel, and then we're going to move fairly quickly into the presentations. The idea will be that we'll have a series of presentations, and then we'll have questions at the end. So our panel comprises Suzanne Shaw from Capri, Amrita Singh, who is from CARICOM, and Natanya Luman, who has done a lot of the work that we're going to be presenting. She is a disaster risk reduction specialist and a consultant, and has been doing the work on behalf of Capri. She's been visiting a lot of the countries to figure out what's happening in terms of data collection and management, and she'll be presenting her findings this morning. So I'm just going to hop over here to the electronic thing. And by magic, you will hear my voice coming out of a different microphone. And just to very quickly talk about measurements. So most of you are familiar with the way in which the UN intends to measure progress towards the Sustainable Development Goals. There's something called the Global Sustainable Development Report. However, because of the number of goals, because of the number of targets, because of the number of indicators, everybody said there's no way we're going to produce one of these on an annual basis. Let's do it every 4 years, kind of like the Olympics. So the first one is going to come out in 2019. It's going to be drafted by an independent group of scientists and experts, and the idea is that they will work with networks of scientists. The point of the report is to get a scientific bent on how well the world is progressing towards attaining the Sustainable Development Goals. So they're going to be working with universities and academies and so on and so forth. And as I said, this will come out, the first one comes out in 2019. It is also supposed to pay special attention to countries in special development situations. This would include small island developing states, landlocked states, and the very heavily indebted states as well. There is a problem, though. And this is something that's been recognized for quite some time. Back in, I think, 2009, Stiglitz, Sen, and Fitoussi, working for the French commission that was set up by the French President Sarkozy at the time, pointed out that GDP, which is something which we're all very comfortable measuring, GDP per capita, is not a measure of economic well-being. It's simply a measure of how large the economy you're living in is. And that doesn't necessarily relate to how well off you as an individual are, especially in societies with high levels of inequality, which, frankly, is most of the societies in the world. We have recognized this, and as a matter of, one of the things that UN does, UNDP does something called measuring the Human Development Index. It's a measure of progress, though many of us in the small island developing states are very quick to point out to anybody in UNDP, it's all very well to measure HDI, but that doesn't change our access to funding. You can be low on the HDI index, but you're still going to be told by the World Bank that your GDP per capita sticks you into a middle income bracket, and no, you can't have any concessional funding, so go away. Not a good situation. Happiness is also an interesting measure. At the moment, it may not necessarily have widespread acceptance, but the acceptance is growing, and I'd suggest that if you haven't already, go to the website, World Happiness Report. It's produced by the Sustainable Development Solutions Network, and it's one of the key reports that we put out. The other key report, which you'll be hearing about, is the SDG Index and Dashboards, which is also produced by the Sustainable Development Solutions Network. Now, for those of you who are on Twitter, which I assume, looking at the demographics here, is probably all the young people seem to have stayed away. Go to UNSDSN on Twitter if you want to follow the Sustainable Development Solutions Network. If you're not a Twitter person, then visit the sdgindex.org and you will get access to the report which was released last year, and later on in July, the report that's going to be released this year. Just a quick thing, what is the point of the index and dashboards? It's a somewhat reduced measure of indices, targets, and measurements to allow us a more accessible way of figuring out how we are moving towards the SDG targets. Helps us to do all the things that we want to do. Are we spending in the right way? What's working, what's not working? And it's published annually, which is very useful. So it's definitely a reduced set of indicators, and we will be hearing more about that. I'm going to now ask Suzanne Shaw to come up and talk a little bit about Capri and its work in this particular project.
Morning, everyone. As David mentioned, my name is Suzanne Shaw. I'm the Director for Sustainability at the Caribbean Policy Research Institute. Just to give you a little bit of background about Capri, we're an economics-focused think tank based right here at the University of the West Indies, and our work is primarily based in looking at issues of public policy interest. Our methods involve economic assessment, policy analysis, cost-benefit assessment, this kind of thing, always based on evidence. That's our main mantra, if you like. Our analyses are based on data and hard evidence, so we know that where our recommendations are objective and in line with data rather than just pure conjecture. So today I'll just give you a brief overview of why we think the SDGs are important as a lead into Natanya's presentation. So as you may know, in 2015, the MDGs, which were the Millennium Development Goals, had expired. The Caribbean didn't perform particularly well with respect to the MDGs. They were not prioritized, whether that be on purpose or as a result of limited resources, we don't really know. But the fact is that we didn't perform particularly well to the MDG targets. But this is not necessarily a bad thing and not necessarily our own fault. In looking at the MDGs, the targets weren't particularly relevant to Caribbean countries. And in the same year that the MDGs expired, the SDGs were formulated. And I'm going to give a little bit of background as to why we think, in as much as the MDGs were not particularly things that the Caribbean needed to, and in fact did not take on board, the SDGs are a little bit of a different story. So the MDGs came about from a global initiative to improve well-being, the well-being of the world's poorest, which is a very noble goal in and of itself. There were 8 goals ranging from eradication of extreme poverty to education access to gender equality, as well as a number of other goals. The problem with these goals was that the targets seem to have been formulated based on the situation and aspirations of, in particular, African countries and sub-Saharan African countries, to be more precise. As a result, the challenges that were sought to be tackled through the MDGs were not necessarily those that were most relevant for the Caribbean region. So I'll give you just 2 examples. One is in the area of health. The MDGs required a 2/3 reduction in the under 5 mortality rate in terms of mortality rate per 1,000 births. if you look at the situation in Africa, where the mortality rate is 152 per 1,000 births, of course, this is a very relevant target. In the Caribbean, where we already have a fairly decent mortality rate of 20 in 1,000, a 2/3 reduction rate would have required us to bring that mortality rate down to 6 or 7, which is already a rate which is better than the United States. So I think you can see that the aspirations were a little bit, perhaps not within our top priorities, given that we're already performing fairly well with respect to that indicator. Another example is gender. In sub-Saharan Africa, where the enrollment of girls is 83% that of boys in primary education, a goal of gender equality related to that particular indicator is very relevant. However, in the Caribbean, where in fact we see that girl enrollment in primary education is greater than that of boys, it's not a particularly relevant indicator for us to be dedicating resources to. So in short, our performance, or our starting point as far as the MDGs were concerned, were already quite good. And to be able to bring ourselves in alignment and achieve the targets of the MDGs would have required fairly significant resources for not a whole lot of improvement, given that we're already starting from a very good basis. If you know anything about economic principles, the law of diminishing returns applies here. With each additional level of improvement, it requires significantly more and more resources. So it's not unreasonable that we didn't dedicate a whole lot of effort and resources to meeting the MDG targets. We had, on the contrary, more pressing problems. So I'll highlight a few here. Security. I think we can all agree that security is a huge issue in the Caribbean. If we think about what we could achieve if we manage to improve our homicide rate and get it to the level of that in, say, Costa Rica, it would mean a 2% improvement in GDP in Dominica, and in the case of Jamaica and Haiti, an improvement of 5% GDP. Now, this is a significant thing to aim for. In terms of disaster management, the economic cost of natural disasters in the region is about $30 billion US. Now, apart from the cost of the disaster itself, it has ramifications to the wider economy in any particular island. It means that resources that could otherwise be spent elsewhere have to be spent on managing the fallout of a natural disaster, which means we get into a cycle of debt, and the implications of that are just broader than the natural disaster itself. So the Caribbean didn't try too hard, perhaps because of our what we perceive to be more important or relevant issues to us than were articulated in the MDGs. On the other hand, the SDGs we think are a different story. I'll just speak about two goals of the SDGs that Capri thinks are particularly important. Goal number 13, which refers to climate change. Now, we might be tempted as small islands to say that climate change, in terms of us having an impact on global warming, is not particularly important. The emissions of the small island developing states contribute about 1% to global emissions, which means that on the overall scheme of things, we don't contribute a huge amount to climate change and the phenomenon of global warming. On the other hand, we are at risk of suffering the most. Small island developing states are low-lying states, which means that the main impacts of climate change, which are sea level rise and sea warming, can and will have significant economic consequences. with projected estimates of global temperatures on that business as usual scenario, sea levels could rise by as much as 1 to 5 meters in 100 years. The implications of this are huge, with a lot of our coastal infrastructure actually potentially at risk. There is direct economic damage and implications which could occur from sea level rise alone. Not to mention the impact on tourism, which is a huge foreign exchange earner for many Caribbean islands. With sea level rise and warming of the sea comes beach erosion, degradation of coral reefs, and bleaching, all of which are key to our tourism sector. And these would be at risk if we don't do something about climate change. Also, the issue of saline intrusion, which is another impact of sea level rise, would affect our groundwater resources. And in Jamaica alone, 84% of our fresh water is groundwater resources. So these are real direct problems that we have to think about. Not to mention the impact of more severe storms, which would come with global warming, and I've already outlined some of the wider economic impacts associated with that. In terms of more direct connections, we have to think about SDG 14, which relates to destruction of marine ecosystems. Paradoxically, our tourism sector depends heavily on the health of our marine ecosystem, but also contributes a lot to the destruction of the marine ecosystem. So this particular SDG is something that we think that the Caribbean small island states should take on board. So, perhaps in time, as the economies of the small island development states of the Caribbean develop, we'll have a greater appreciation of the benefit of a healthy environment. And as we develop, we know that as countries tend to get richer, their concern about the environment increases. But can we really afford to wait till we get to that stage of development? I don't think so. So buying into the SDGs and achieving the goals of the SDGs requires a global commitment. The way to get that global commitment is through participation. We expect that to be able to get others on board, the Caribbean has to own up to its obligations under the SDGs to be able to reap the benefits that it can hope to gain through global adherence to the SDGs, through those two goals that I've mentioned in particular, but also the broader goals of the SDGs, where we have a much more vested interest compared to the Millennium Development Goals. And on that note, I would like to leave the space for our next speaker, which David will introduce, who will give you some more interesting information on how the Caribbean is performing in relation to the SDGs.
Suzanne, thank you very much. I would like it if we could please welcome Amrita Singh. She is a Senior Project Officer working in Sustainable Development for the CARICOM. And she's going to be taking the podium as soon as I can get her presentation up in front of everybody. So could we please welcome Amrita Singh.
Good morning, ministers, colleagues. What I'm going to try to do with my 10 to 15 minutes is basically go through the CARICOM approach to the SDGs and our prioritization of how we're going to measure our performance via the monitoring of our indicators, as well as what we're doing as a region to strengthen the underlying infrastructure that is necessary to measure. Now, I'm going to ask for some indulgence to basically do some history going back to 1992. Rio Convention, and it goes before that as well. Chapter 40, information for decision making, prioritized as critical for achieving sustainable development. 2 years later, the first SIDS conference, and whenever we get an opportunity to present on these things, we like to remind everybody that the SIDS have a CARICOM birth certificate. The first SIDS conference was held in Barbados in 1994. And we, again, prioritized the need and the importance of information to monitor SIDS sustainable development. And the sad thing is that if you're into the sustainable development studies, if you trace all the agreements, Mauritius, and most recently some more, you will see that SIDS are consistently saying we have issues with data, statistics, and information. And it's not to say that we haven't been doing anything, but just to say that it remains a perennial problem. Now, the other thing I wanted to highlight, I understand that we have some young people as well in the audience, is that the SDGs were not a surprise to CARICOM. I made the point yesterday that we are small, so we don't have the luxury of having new negotiation, machinery for each international agreement. It was preceded by the Samoa, preparations for Samoa, which was the Program of Action on Small Island Developing States in 2014. And this region was critically involved. Jamaica hosted the regional preparation, Barbados hosted the interregional preparations, and Barbados led the development of the zero draft for what eventually became the Samoa pathway. So we were instrumentally involved in the development of that document, and we went into the post-2015 making the point that it has to take some more on board. So it wasn't like we were passengers to this process. We were integrally part of the process. And so the other, I don't want us to get bogged down in my slides, but just to say that the other critical thing that happened in 2014 was that our heads of government approved the CARICOM strategic plan. It's on the CARICOM website. You can download the whole thing and read it at your leisure. It's two very substantive documents. And we took the opportunity of doing several alignments during that period to see how the strategic plan stacked up against Samoa and how it stacked up against the 2030 development agenda. So if you would permit me just to read briefly. The strategic initiatives proposed by the CARICOM strategic plan targets key sectors during the planning period, focusing on building resilience through a range of cross-cutting initiatives, which take account of the relationships among 6 thematic areas. They're listed here as goals, so you can see some of the goals. For example, Goal 1, which basically intersects with many of the SDGs, to engender sustainable growth of the economies of member states, and that will address strategic activities in our key sectors, agriculture, industry, etc. So taking into account relationships among 6 thematic areas, for example, the specific human capacity development or ICT requirements to unleash the growth sectors for building economic resilience, or the actions to strengthen community governance and institutional arrangements that will engender higher level of efficacy, responsiveness, and results for social and environmental resilience. Therefore, to ensure economic, social, environmental, and technological resilience, a unified community with strong and efficient community institutions are prerequisite. So I listened, I got here yesterday, but I followed online, and I listened to particularly the interventions of member states. And sometimes we take certain things for granted when we compare ourselves to other regions. What CARICOM is blessed with was the vision to set up specialist institutions. And we have strong institutions that, are not, that are seen as best practices across the region, across other SIDS regions. For example, we have the 5 Cs, which deal with climate change. We have CARDI, which deals with agriculture. We have CIMH, which monitors our meteorology and hydrology. We have CRFM, which was recently a star at the SDG 14 conference in New York. So CARICOM, in its vision, has set up a number of specialist institutions, which, and of course, UE is an associate institution of the CARICOM, which have the ability to support our member states. Yes, the SDGs are country-driven, but what CARICOM's history is that where there is the possibility for shared or regional approach to achieve advancement, we go that route. And there are parts of the SDGs where a regional approach might be, more strategic for us. So I don't want to go through, I'm not going to bog everybody down, but if you go, each goal of the strat plan lines up neatly and vice versa with the 2030 development agenda. I'm going to ask Professor to help me bring up my next presentation. So it's the Excel. I'll maneuver from here. Okay, so the other key issue, the key issue that we're here to discuss in this morning's presentation, coming out of our strat plan, what I want, before I go into the second part of the presentation, it should be noted at the 36th regular meeting of heads, which was held in Barbados in July 2015. The heads recognized and called for closer congruence of the Sustainable Development Goals, the CARICOM Strategic Plan, and the Samoa Pathway. Specifically, the heads, inter alia, one of the, in the list of decisions, this one has relevance to what we're discussing this morning. They committed to the implementation of the post-2015 development agenda through mainstreaming the relevant SDG targets and indicators in national and regional policy and development and planning frameworks, including the CARICOM strategic plan, and further emphasize that the goals articulated in the Samoa pathway should be entrenched in the post-2015. So that was just before we actually went into the 2015 development agenda negotiations. So that provided impetus for our very formidable head of regional stats, Dr. Philemon Harrison, who has been coordinating. I saw in some of the presentations there was mention of the regional statistical program. And like everything that we do in CARICOM, it's member state driven. So there is a standing committee of statisticians where the director of stats of each CARICOM country, as well as some of the observer states, they meet on a regular basis to plan, to coordinate, to share experiences, to strategize, and basically help each other out as much as possible. This is also critical in terms of harmonizing approaches, methodologies, etc. These statisticians were also involved in the international work that took place to develop the indicators to monitor the SDG framework. And what CARICOM realized very early is that we cannot feasibly, because of this the systemic, constraint that we have with data and information, it will be impossible and unrealistic for us to monitor all the indicators. So we came up with what is called CARICOM-specific indicators. And this was the framework that was basically utilized to go through all the indicators and then prioritize what would be the CARICOM-specific ones. So you would see that basically what it was decided in a nutshell is that, I'm not sure if you can see, you would see that, okay, so the indicator may be a national priority, it's in Samoa, it was in the CARICOM specific MDGs, because we also had this program for monitoring of the MDGs. And then we went through, we had the technical inputs, we had the statistical inputs. And we came up with 114, well, it's actually less 5, so 109, because some repeat, especially in biodiversity. Let me see. So you have some that repeat. So it's essentially 109 indicators that we think we can realistically measure in CARICOM. And the idea is that we're not going to stick to it. The idea is that we're going to probably migrate some of the other from the larger list as we gain strengths and as we gain, additional resources. So we have another heads decision where the CARICOM action plan on statistics was prioritized and approved. PM Keith Mitchell, who started his career, I understand, as a statistician, took leadership for it and drove the process. And we've also received funding from the OECD to do a specific initiative to help CARICOM with monitoring and measurement of our CARICOM-specific SDG indicators. So in closing, I just wanted to sort of bring some points together from yesterday and today. For SIDS, and these things are all interlinked, because not because we're not talking about resource mobilization here, doesn't where we're talking about indicators and dashboards, doesn't mean it's not critical, because all aspects of sustainable development are inextricably key to our survival and our development in this region. So the multilateral development cooperation is critical for the pursuit of the CARICOM's part to sustainable development. We emphasis on building capacity, strengthening national economic management systems, and mainstreaming appropriate risk management frameworks for CARICOM SIDS is critical. The evidence-based policy making, which requires data and statistics, we have prioritized it, and because we've seen that it's critical for effective decisions to be made by our policymakers, and of course in formulating policy and in project development, as well as for monitoring and evaluation. And another point that was mentioned by Dr. Smith this morning is, as many of us are classified as middle-income countries, which locks us out of concessional financing to assist in building the resilience we require, and prevents us from escaping the debt trap, which constrains our development. So all these things are linked. If we had more space, we would be able to invest more in our data infrastructure. But having said that it's a constraint, just to show everyone that the region is not sitting back and resting on that constraint, we are actively working. We're trying to see how we can cooperate so that we advance together, learn from the strengths of the other member states so that we can learn from each other, and where a regional approach can advance us, use a regional approach. So I'll just stop there. Thanks very much for your attention.
Thank you very much. And so we're learning that there are some indicators which may be more important than others, and some which are particularly important for CARICOM and for the Caribbean. And we're going to hear now a bit about the Global Sustainable Development Goals Index and Dashboard, which is produced by the United Nations Sustainable Development Solutions Network. It's looking at a reduced set of goals. When it first came out, if you look at the website for 2016, you'll see that it doesn't include very many SIDS. We had made that point to the SDSN, and as a result of that, they have started to fund work between the University of the West Indies, the Caribbean Policy Research Institute, and we hope as well, CARICOM, to start getting more Caribbean SIDS included in the SDG index and dashboard. The person who's been doing most of that work has been Natania Luman, and I'm going to ask her to please come up and tell everybody what she's been doing over the last several months. So could you give her a round of applause, please?
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. Good morning, everyone. Good morning. Thank you. Okay, so before I start, I want to give you some questions for you to ponder. These are questions that we've tried answering over the last 2 months. Particularly, we signed on as Caribbean countries and small island states and UN member states. We signed on to the SDGs in 2015. So it has been 2 years since. So the question I want to ask, as countries, have we measured our baseline? Do we know our starting point? We've signed on to the goals and we're agreeing to the goals, but what's our starting point? Having asked ourselves that, we now need to ask, how do we prioritize or implement or monitor or evaluate? How do we reform our strategies? So these are questions I want you to keep in the back of your head as I go through my presentation. So I'll try to be brief. I'll quickly go through the introduction. I'll tell you, I won't go into what the SDGs are because this has been 2 weeks and you guys would have had enough of that. I will briefly go through the approach we used, the results we've had so far, as well as some recommendations that we've put together. So like we said, there are 17 goals. They straddle 3 dimensions, which is the social, the economic, and the environmental. And they're being monitored by one particular organization, the Sustainable Development Solutions Network. And like Dr. Smith says, we're aiming to publish a report annually. That report annually will help countries to see where they are, how they're performing. So this is what the dashboard that we published looks like, briefly. I won't go too much in it. So what's the purpose of the dashboard? The dashboard helps countries to recognize where they are now. It ranks your achievement for each particular goal. And of course, it is an aggregated index. So we know we have 240-something variables that are squashed into 169 targets, which are further squashed into the 17 goals. So graphically, when you look at the dashboard, it's presenting an aggregated index as to what your performance is for the particular goal. But when you drill down into the dashboard, it will give you performance for all your variables, all your indicators, and all your targets. So what we're aiming to do is that we're trying to raise the profile of the SDGs, and we're trying to promote discussion among countries for the SDGs. So if you could look at the dashboard and you gauge where you're performing as a particular country, and you look across the Caribbean and you see another country that's performing better than you begin to have that dialogue. Could we have knowledge sharing platforms? What is it you're doing that is better than us? Can we learn from you? Can we share? We're also using it as a means of challenging countries to accelerate their implementation plans as well as their performance plans. So here I'll give you an example of what the 2016 report indicated for Jamaica. So Jamaica's overall performance, the 2016 report looked at 149 countries, and we ranked 63 variables across those 149 countries. So Jamaica's performance came out at 77 from that 149 countries. As a region, we're ranking at 57.1. And of course, all these scores are out of 100 because we're using an aggregated index, 100 being the maximum for your best performance and 0 being the minimum for performance. So if we graphically look at this, we're recognizing that Jamaica is perhaps doing well in goal number 1 and goal number 17. But then we see a proliferation of reds, which normally means you're not doing so good, right? So this is to give you an idea so you could gauge how do you prioritize, how do you allocate your limited resources for attainment of the SDGs. So how is it measured? We start off with the green. So if you're performing exceptionally well, you're in the top tier of the quartiles that we've developed, and your dashboard would indicate green for good performance. The middle quartile would be yellow. So if you're not doing so good and you're in your mid-range, need areas for improvements, then your country will be categorized as a yellow. If you're not doing good at all, or you really need to start focusing on these areas, then that is going to be categorized in red and gives you an idea what are those areas report. So there is the absence of an additional 10 countries across the English-speaking Caribbean. Here I've highlighted them. But for inclusion in the report, we needed countries that had 80% of coverage across the 63 variables that we're using. So this is just showing you the data gaps for those countries that were not included. So we have a problem. As small island states, how could we not be included in the global report? Are you saying that our population is not significant, our contributions are not significant? So this brings a lot of questions to the forefront. Why is it we weren't included? So CAPRI, through IS, is for inclusion. But as small island states, we've all signed on to work together as a community. So it's not just Caribbean SIDS that are impacted, Pacific SIDS, Oceanic SIDS, there are many other SIDS that are impacted. So we want to share, knowledge sharing, like we said from the get-go, wanted to share the best practices that we've learned, what worked for us, how did we close our gaps, can we extrapolate these lessons learned across the Pacific SIDS. So we also attempted to do that as well. So how did we do that? First, we identified what were those missing Caribbean countries. We then decided to target 2 or 3 of those Caribbean countries, particularly because we had a short time within which to operate and we had a limited budget within which to operate. Having done that, we conducted literature review to find out what are our baselines, what are we working with. Having done the literature review, we narrowed it down from the 10 countries that were missing, 4 countries that we could target. And these 4 countries were targeted particularly because we got high rates of response from the countries, and they did indicate to us that the data exists within their countries. So we selected those 4 countries, and then we went to the countries and we conducted interviews. So we met with the prime ministers, the members of parliaments, the statistical unit persons, as many persons as possible that are responsible for data collection, monitoring, and analysis on the ground. I won't be presenting data for your countries, but I could guarantee you it's going to be included in the 2018 report. Okay, so we're also going to lay out a strategy. How do we prevent future gaps, and what were some of the issues I encountered in closing the gaps? So like we said, we needed 63 variables across the 10 countries. Readily, we had these numbers for the different countries, and we identified what were the missing numbers. Having done the visits, we're able to acquire much of what we needed. So then we now have 74% coverage for Antigua, 74% for Dominica, 73% for St. Kitts, and 86% coverage for St. Lucia. So here we go. This is the dashboard. So having acquired the data, this is what we prepare. So this is the 2017 report. So Barbados, if you may have realized when I showed the initial slide, was initially not included in the 2016 report because we had data gaps. Barbados is now included. We have Cuba, we have Domrep, Guyana, Haiti, Jamaica, and we also have Trinidad and Tobago. So looking at this for goal number 9, we recognize that most of our countries are not doing so good, right? Right? So this is now going to say to you as you go back home to your different member states and your different countries, perhaps goal number 9 is something we need to drill down on. What are those variables? What are the component parts for goal number 9? Which ones are we not doing so good in, and which ones could we improve on? I should point out to you that this report will be officially launched July 2nd, after which the data will be available online via the SDSN network. So you guys could go download the data, you could download the metadata, it will give you all the breakdown for the variables and stuff, and you're better able to understand the data itself. So we move across to the remaining. For goal number 13, climate action, we're seeing some greens and some yellows, so that indicates that we're doing something so far. But I should also point out, the areas that are in white, it would have meant that we don't have sufficient data in those areas to measure, so we're not able to calculate for those. All right, so what were some of the issues that we encountered on the ground? It wasn't that SIDS weren't included because the data was unavailable. Data was available. But we often found it was not made public. So I literally had to try to strong arm a lot of the persons within the respective countries. I did many calls and emails and beggings and pleading, and I had to explain and re-explain why is it we needed the data. We need data to make empirical decisions. Like, our policies are to be underpinned by data. How do we allocate our budgetary resources if we don't have the data to say to you how to prioritize? We also recognize that the data we're getting from most of the countries was outdated. This is particularly because some of our instruments are collected, like the census is over a 10-year period. So the data you're going to get from that is not very accurate if you want something to be published yearly for you to understand how you're attaining these goals and how you're progressively moving through the goals. We also recognize that the data was disaggregated across many units and ministries. So if I needed broadband data, they sent me to the cellular collector person. The cellular person told me, oh no, this is proprietary information. My opponents can't know what my percentage coverage is because it's going to undermine my business. So we recognize that there are many on-the-ground issues. The other thing is that we recognize that the data was just not available. So the SDGs have pointed out to us that there are many areas for which data is needed that are not currently collected. So we need to create new data sources as well as new data sets. So what were some of the commonalities among the variables? So for example, for 0% hunger, we realized most of the countries that we visited, nobody was measuring or monitoring Sustainable Nitrogen Management Index. I asked and persons would have looked at me, what's that? I don't know about that. We don't measure that. So this is one of the particular areas that we recognize that we need education. So even though we're measuring these goals and we've signed on to these goals, we need to have intimate knowledge as to what are the breakdown constituent components of the goals and what is required of us, and we also need to begin to train our staff. Like I said, I'll get into the solutions, some of the proposals and solutions. The other one is good health and well-being. We realized that was also not something that was measured across the different states. And of course, this is particularly important because it's a social dimension that is used for measurements of progress across different countries. Goal number 9, which I would have pointed out to you on the dashboard initially, was highlighted in red for most countries. That's because we're also not tracking the different constituent components for goal number 9. And like Dr. Shaw pointed out, as small island states, we should particularly be interested in climate change. So when we got to climate change vulnerability monitor, we also had the same response. Persons were telling me, it's too complex, it's hard to be calculated, it's hard to monitor, we don't know what data sets are needed. So this also pointed out to us that having signed on to the goals, we need more information, more knowledge. And the final one that was particularly interesting is peace, justice, and strong institutions. We realized that we're scoring particularly low in that. When I asked about property rights, persons tell me, oh yeah, they'll chop each other up over property, but we really don't know how to measure or track. And I'm like, so how about intellectual property rights? They go, ooh, we don't really talk about that here because everybody burns their own CDs and DVDs and stuff. So these are some of the things that we need to take into consideration as we really sign on to the goals. Do we really know what we're signing on to? And are we really committed to attaining these goals? And what are our plans for doing so? So what are our proposed solutions? Like we said, we realized there's need for new data and new data sources. So our censuses or multi-index surveys or survey living conditions and stuff do not currently contain a lot of the variables that need to be measured. So we need to identify new sources. So for example, literacy rates. That's something that's not currently captured in our census. So we perhaps ask for education attainment, years of enrollment in school, many other questions that are centered around education, but no direct question that says, hey, here's a sheet of paper with a sentence. Could you read it for me, please? So we don't know how to test for literacy. So it's not something that is measured, but it's something that we need to start measuring. And these are just other variables that are going to be new data sets that SDGs are asking us to measure and monitor that are not currently captured in any of the instruments. Unmet demand for contraceptive, or for example, female to male above 25 school information. We'll track them to high school, but after high school we forget about them. We don't know what percentages are enrolled in tertiary institutions or moving on to trades or whatever. So there are perhaps 2 of the 4 countries that I visited who could give me enrollment, but they couldn't triangulate to tell me if there was comprehensive coverage for all the countries. Also, fish stock and overexploited collapse. This will help us for climate change monitoring as well as protecting our oceans and stuff. So these are just examples. The report is going to be more comprehensive. It will go in more details and give you all those new variables and data sets that we need to worry about. The other thing is that we need centralized data collection or compilation sources. So for example, when I asked, do we have 100%, it didn't. So there are gaps. So we need to find ways to centralize these data sources or just a compilation of the data that we're putting together. And this also pertains to crime, traffic accidents and stuff, because this will impact your health-related goals. The other, for example, health data, like we said, we weren't monitoring well-being. Mortality rates couldn't be calculated for some of the countries because they didn't have the baseline data that they needed to do the calculations. And one particular thing that weren't currently tracking are like critical illnesses, lifestyle diseases and stuff. Prevalences of AIDS is being done, but we're not extrapolating for the other diseases and stuff. And like Dr. Shaw would have pointed out in her initial presentation, we didn't really readily grab onto the MDGs because they're measuring stuff that weren't particularly related to us. So for us within the Caribbean, one of the problems that we're having is an increase in lifestyle illnesses and stuff, but we're not currently tracking or monitoring, so we don't know what plans to put in place to protect our population moving forward. Then the other one would have been environmental and energy data. This one seems to be complex, so we're going to propose a solution as to how we could address that particular one. The other thing we need to do as nation states is that we need to start tapping into academia. We need to tap into those multilateral agencies and international surveys that are done. So for example, here on campus, we have a lot of master's and PhD students that their projects could be weaved into whatever national goals or priorities you have that could help you with empirical evidence to inform your policy basis going forward. We also, like I said, have many multilateral agencies. Through the course of our research, we met with example for CDB, and I'd be happy to say CDB have since signed on with UNDP to provide resources and to help each member state with the attainment of the SDGs. So there are many multilateral organizations that are providing surveys and fundings to assist us. Let's start tapping into those sources. And these are just examples of international surveys that are done that we could call upon these international companies to say, hey, you're doing this, could you include my country? Because at the country level, we don't have the necessary resources. There's also the UN. The UN has many initiatives. So for example, UNICEF sponsors the mixed survey, but mixed survey is not really done in many other countries, even though UNICEF will pay for it for free. So that's something we could consider. So the other thing would be region-specific teams. So if it is that within small island states we don't have the technical expertise, if we begin to create region-specific teams to help, for example, with our environmental goals, we're saying climate change vulnerability is hard to monitor, we're saying sustainable nitrogen management index is hard to wrap our minds around. But if we create region-specific teams where we get persons with this dedicated knowledge to form a cohort and move from country to do this data collection, they'll clean the data, they'll monitor the data, they'll analyze the data. It will take the burden off the statistical offices, persons, as well as the individual persons in the state, because that's also something we realize. There's minimum capacities within many of the countries, and the expertise is not really there. But if we begin to think as a region and operate as a region, we'll be able to achieve more as a region. So most of the suggestions that I'm proposing for the Caribbean SIDS, I'm also proposing for the Pacific SIDS, because we're similar in geography, economy, and many other things. So for the Pacific SIDS, we're also suggesting to them to tap into local academics, multilateral organizations, surveys, tap into UN. Another thing that I've found that worked with those particular countries that I visited that had already appointed SDG focal point persons within the stats office were more receptive to my visit. They were already aware as to what SDGs were, why I was there, why we needed the data sets. So this is particularly a good practice that we could move across to the other countries. If there's a SDG focal point person, that person will be responsible for central compilation and monitoring and dissemination of the data. It would also be good if we could appoint steering committees, because we realize to solve the disaggregation across different units and ministries, one particular prime minister, so for example, he has agreed to pen a letter sending across to all the different ministries, private sector stakeholders and stuff. We have signed on to the SDGs. The SDGs require to us to do XYZ. Therefore, we're asking you to partner with us, make this data available on an annual basis, send it across to our SDG focal point persons within our statistics office. So if we could have steering committees that are set up that straddles all the different economic, social, and environment components, and have those persons putting in the regular policies and regulatory frameworks that we need, it will help us to attain the SDGs as we move forward. There is also the need to identify what are those variables that are occurring in the SDG indicator data sets that we don't yet collect, that we now need to start collecting. So what are the new data that we need? And we also need to identify the new data sources. Are we going to modify our existing instruments? One of the things that CARICOM have put forward is that for the 2020 census that is coming up, they have incorporated a few changes in the census instrument. So for example, they're now going to be monitoring for literacy rate. But do we need to develop new data sources? The census comes every 10 years, but we really need to find out solutions that's going to happen long before the 10 years. Because if we wait until 2020, then we literally only have 5 years left to achieve the SDGs. So that wouldn't have gotten us very far. So what are the new data sources that we could tap into before that time comes? Can we modify our survey of living conditions? Can we modify our multi-indicator cluster surveys? Or do we need to create new survey instruments to collect these data sources? So finally, having done this, having looked at the dashboards and the tables, we're coming up with some recommendations. We recognize there's a need for a business process management system. So we need a central database system for you to program, document all your stuff. And we're also proposing the sharing of technology regionally. And this second recommendation ties with the first. So for example, many of our statistics offices would have already had DevInflow, the program. Many of our stats persons would have already been programmed, trained how to use this particular program. So if we could create the relevant dictionaries with the SDG indicators, pre-program these into DevInflow, it means going forward your work is pretty easy. All you need to do is just enter the data when it comes to the data sharing and entering. But another thing that we've heard so far from another of the participants for the conference since we started is that many countries are so small, they lack the resources. So if we could come together as a team and share that one platform, I think the example was Montserrat, Antigua, and St. Kitts. So you're in close proximity to each other. So if you create one shared database and platform, and you break out those variables across different constituent parts, and you say, I will do this, you'll do that one, it becomes easier because you're collaborating and you're sharing the efforts, and it becomes easier to use. And if you have this platform, it will be easier for the SDSN network to pull from this platform the data set that we need to create the global report at the end of the day. So we wouldn't have to pay a consultant to trek across all the different countries every single time we need data. And I wouldn't have to call you and bother you and ask you, please give me this data, because it's already there. So it saves time, resources, and energy. We're also asking for ongoing dedicated technical assistance for the SDG process. And this is something, for example, the university could help with. Because many of these things are above is the wrong word. Many of these things are complex. So for example, the stats office are already short in terms of staff. We may have a demographer who is doing the work of a statistician, or we have statisticians who are doing the work of demographers. So it's hard to straddle all the different variables and indicators because we have limited capacities. But if you have a dedicated cohort of technical assistant persons who are on your call, you could pick up the phone and call, you could Skype or you could email. This will help us as we move forward as a region. We're also trying, like I said, to identify region-specific teams, particularly for the scientific data collection, monitoring, and analysis. And we need investments in overall capacity for the countries. Investments may not necessarily mean additional resources, because like I said, many ODAs are out there, they're available. We just need to identify what the to tap into this. But another thing is we need to the staff complement within the statistical offices, so then we have more persons who are able to provide the reporting that we need for the SDGs. And like I said, tap into the existing lines of funding. They're there. We don't need new funding. They exist already. Just find ways to tap in. And collaboratively, if we pool as a region and start writing proposals and stuff to these multilateral agencies, they'll respond to us because they're already on the ground doing the work anyway. But if we have empirical evidence to support our claims, if we could track to say, for climate change monitoring, we've implemented this particular policy, we've tracked it for the last 3 years, we're not getting much traction, could you assist us? We would have had the empirical evidence to show that we're doing something and we're really tracking and monitoring, but we're not getting very far with our limited resources. So that, therefore, is empirical evidence. The suggestion is that we need to align CARICOM SDG in.
And if the technicians could just raise the screens and the lights. And we're going to now go into a period of discussion and questions. So ministers and heads of...
That will directly translate into public policies, at least in the finances of it. So thank you.
Just a quick clarification. When you say LAC, you mean?
Latin America, Caribbean. Sorry, that's an UNDP acronym. So
Yes.
thank you.
Okay. That's an interesting comment, and I think also people probably might want to discriminate between those two parts of that acronym. Many of us often in the Caribbean sometimes feel that we're unfairly lumped with Latin America. Other questions and comments? Yes.
Great. Well, I wanted to begin by first thanking the presenters, because that was really, from my perspective, an excellent series of presentations that were very practical. And I mean, I also actually have to say, having sat through the conference now and coming into the 2.5 days, this set of presentations actually makes me feel very hopeful for the way that we can start to, that we can work together. I had a specific question, and that was when we talked about the work that CARICOM was doing to identify Caribbean-specific indicators. We also talked earlier, the earlier presentation talked about the need to be prioritized and focused on the indicators that matter most to the region. And then you talked about the 63 indicators, if I got it straight, that the network was, that you had gone out in search of, let's say. Can you talk about the overlap between your 63 indicators and the prioritized indicators that CARICOM is trying to develop? Are we talking about the same thing? Which I seriously hope we are. So thank you.
Okay. Let's see if we can have the panel respond to those two first comments, and then we'll open the floor again for some questions.
Okay. Thank you for that. So before I answer, I perhaps need to put a caveat to my response. The 63 indicators that were included in the 2016 report were included because they were the most frequently occurring indicators across the 149 countries that we measured. In relation to your detailed analysis, at a glance of the 63, I should also point out that the SDSN indicators do not align 100% with the SDGs. Some of them are used as proxy indicators, particularly because when we started the work, the data didn't exist. But there were some international surveys that we could have tapped into that would have given us proxies that we could use to extrapolate for on-the-ground scenarios. So, from memory, please don't quote me, I could do the analysis at a later date. At a glance, of the 114 that CARICOM are presenting, there are perhaps 26 that were frequently occurring specifically as it relates to the variables that are included in the SDGs. And that was just at a glance. I could do a more detailed analysis to give you of the total, so please don't quote me. I didn't do that analysis at that point.
Sorry, just my response is going to be, I didn't look at the overlap either, my apologies. But just to say, my response is going to be optimistic. I tend to be a glass half full person. And having worked on indicators in this region for a while, now just because they don't show up, or you know, you may see them not available, doesn't mean that they don't exist. when you work in this region, please be assured, CARICOM citizens, we are not making decisions willy-nilly. There's data. but what happens is when you're a professional, a technical person in this region, what you go on very often is your relationships with your colleagues. So very often the data is there. The people around know how to find it, but it's not in a centralized system, which is why the CARICOM and the member states keep on stressing the need for a strengthened national statistical system and national statistical infrastructure. I'll tell you why. Now, I heard a comment on Monday that environmental statistics is a new area. Theoretically, it's not a new area, it's a younger area when you compare it to economic data and social data. What has happened, and remember when environment and the multilateral environmental agreements came into place, there were some areas that are now considered environment that were already being collected by agriculture, by different ministries. So you have a scenario now where environmental data is spread over several different ministries, not in one ministry, and it doesn't neatly fit into the existing statistical system. And the other thing is most of our statistical system by an act which go back to the 60s. So we even have to update our acts to now get environmental data feeding into the system. And so is not the sexy part of data and information, is the slogging. And that is what we're trying to do as a region, to have a smooth transition where all those little arms that do collection of environmental information now feed it neatly into the national statistical system, where when UN is collecting data, they can reach out to STATS and STATS can give them, the information. What STATS has to do now is when, let's say UN STATS, which does this wonderful questionnaire every year, and they collect different environmental statistics. When STATS gets it, the first thing they do is pick up the phone and call someone in environment. And then that person in environment will call their colleague in Water Authority or Ministry of Agriculture. And that is the reality of what has to happen in this region for us to centralize data. So it's not that it doesn't exist, it's that we now have to institutionalize, put in the administrative structures to make environment, which is the youngest dimension, smoothly fit in as it does for economic data and social data.
Thank you very much. Can we get to you in 1 second, and we'll just take a question from the front and then immediately to the lady on the left side.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Smith. I would like to thank the presenters for excellent presentations, I think, very informed and very well delivered. So let me take the opportunity to say that. I wanted to make a comment on the problem of so-called data availability or lack of availability of data for specific purposes. And I share perhaps the pain, in a sense, having been someone who had at one stage to try to put together recommendations based upon statistics that are often either not so much missing as statistics often, or data bottled up in different segments of government or even in the private sector. And it is not uncommon for the claims of confidentiality and secrecy to be invoked, when in fact the data actually has absolutely no relevance to anyone in the sense of being, can be justifiably classified as confidential. And that is something that we really perhaps need to tackle at the policy level. I think that is an obvious area that governments themselves have to address. The other dimension, I think, has to do with the fact that very often the data, when collected, is not used by a range of relevant actors. And if you take, for example, statistics collected at the airport, where they collect statistics on a variety of things, including health and where you've traveled, for the most part, and I dare say that this applies to the entire region, but most certainly in the case of Guyana, that information from time to time is broken down to get a few figures on movement of people, immigration, and the rest of it lies there completely unused unless researchers are somehow persuaded to go and dig into those files. And you speak about books or logbooks, logs, thousands of bits of information, they're completely unused. So to the extent that these indicators we're talking about in relation to SDGs now form part of things that governments have to answer to, their policies, and at the multilateral level, it may perhaps contribute to the stats bureaus and others actually trying to ensure that that information goes out. Part of the problem is that if stats collects the information and nobody else uses it, then even the quality of the information or the change in form in which it's collected doesn't take place, because it's the collectors who are using the information, and the end users are either not perhaps in a position to access or are not really interested. And the last comment, if I may, has to do with the idea of utilizing the academia and research institutions for helping to deal with some of these areas, either in relation to collection or analysis. I think it's an excellent idea. One of the things, certainly I have found, is that you can often get some resistance to this arising from, again, pigeonholing of responsibilities. For example, scholarship funds or the award of scholarships lies in the realm of one agency, very often education or some such entity. Those who may be seeking to get the data to use may lie in agencies without political influence within a cabinet, for example. And the Ministry of Finance has its own interests, although in Guyana's case, the Ministry of Finance has responsibility for the Stats Bureau. The interest in the stats doesn't go as far as, for example, saying, look, you have gaps in these areas, why don't we provide some scholarships, or some of the students going to study postgrad in stats, why don't we ask them to look at some specific problems which can help us? And often that is resisted. So again, it perhaps is something that we can tackle at the policy level and try to raise awareness so that this is something, this particular type of lack of information can be dealt with. But I enjoy the presentations and I like to express appreciation for that.
Thank you very much. If somebody could take this to the lady on the far side. Oh, you have a microphone. Great. Lovely. Please go ahead.
Thank
There should be a switch on the side. Yes.
Thank you very much, ladies, for your presentation. I think it has brought to the fore the fact that sought to improve, and in terms of lessons learned, to ensure that through the SDGs there is comparability. And I'm not sure that with the proxies that have been used, particularly for indicators where we haven't really arrived at some kind of consensus around how they would be measured, if that is actually giving a true reflection of the country and also how it is reflected in the index. To add as well, several points I have to raise, but this is my
point, please.
My last point, I think they're all very critical, is that the OAS, and you made a point about ensuring that their countries have a platform in which they are able, through entities like yourself, are able to access information around the SDG indicators. And to indicate that through the OAS, they have a free platform, a data platform for the SDGs that they are marketing to countries, and that I think would be something useful for the governments who are here to examine and to tap into, but of course with your technical teams to look on the possibility of this particular platform. Thank you.
Thank you. We're going to have 3 more comments before I ask the panel to respond. We've got a lady at the standing microphone over there. Then we've got a lady from, I believe, the UN agency, and also we'll finish with Elsie, and then we'll go back to the panel. After the, we'll do a round, and then we come back. Yeah.
Okay. Hello, hello.
Yes, we can hear.
Okay. I'm good. Yeah, okay. Thank you for acknowledging me. Good morning. Ladies, thank you very much for the presentation. It was very informative. My question is for the rep from the Institute. Yeah, SN Institute. So Arthur Lewis, no, sorry.
This one?
Then, yes, sorry, SNDS, sorry.
Tanya, for you.
Yeah, but somewhat similar to the previous question. Your dashboard, it appears to assume that the statistical offices are expected to monitor all the targets and indicators, regardless of whether they fit within the country's priorities within their national plan. So it is, in my opinion, it is unfair to put red for some countries because it may not be their priority for this period. It may be a priority maybe in another 5 years or so. So the SDGs is only relevant to a country based on its priorities at the time. Thank you.
Okay. Yes?
Sharifa Ali Abdullah, Assistant Resident Rep, Trinidad and Tobago, UNDP's office. Thank you very much, ladies, for a very refreshing presentation. And I was just thinking, perhaps if this presentation was done earlier during the conference, it would have saved a lot of heartache and issues. It was, you know, there were lots of panels that dealt with data and data issues, indicators, etc. And I was like, you know, thinking last night, how do we move this forward? And your presentation really had, you know, the issues and solutions. So it was very refreshing. Thank you very much. Just one comment in terms of, you know, one of the issues that you may want to look at. I'm not sure whether I missed it and whether your presentation dealt with limitations. And I think some of the comments that have been echoed here, perhaps, you know, would deal with that as well. For instance, if you look at the data sets that you're using, are they comparable? Are they harmonized across the countries? Because, you know, invariably countries would compare, you know, one another with each other. And therefore, in terms of, for instance, poverty, if we look at poverty data, for one country, Trinidad and Tobago, for instance, you may be using poverty data that's, you know, a couple of years old, probably using the household budgetary survey rather than a survey of living conditions that another country may be using. There may be poverty data that's more recent that may show an increase in poverty also. So I think in terms of, you know, the limitations of your data sets, looking at some of the quality issues, different data sources, you may want to add a slide on that so that when we are using the dashboard, we know, okay, these are some of the assumptions you've made, these are some of the concerns and so forth. So, but thank you very much. Again, this was very, very encouraging, and like one of the other participants said, it has left me very hopeful and very excited about moving forward and implementing the SDGs.
Thank you. Elsie?
Elsie Lawrence Shunon, UNDP Deputy Representative in Jamaica. And yes, I'm very happy about these 3 presentations. My first comment has to do with what Tony Shea mentioned before. I mean, I'm just building on that a bit. I know there are a lot of ongoing things happening, particularly the OAS platform. It would be good if perhaps we can see what's happening. And my question is, have you looked at also what's been happening and see how we can harmonize the various efforts so that we do not duplicate other things and we really build on strength of each other. The recommendations are excellent, I believe, because one of the outcomes of the conference is really to make sure that we come up with specific recommendations. And these are very specific recommendations that we can try to implement. So my question is, do you see how these recommendations can be implemented? Would you think that perhaps a CARICOM group in particular or some partner could lead on this? Because if these 9, I believe, recommendations you mentioned can be implemented, that could really lead, move us forward a lot in achievement of the SDGs. So it would be good if we can take these recommendations forward and actually identify responsibilities, roles, dates, timelines, whatever, and how they're going to be measured.
Thank you. I'm going to ask the panel if they could respond to some of the comments and questions that have been made. After that, we'll have time probably for 2 final questions before we have to close the session.
Okay, I'm going to try to answer as many as I can. Okay, for the lady in red, I forgot your name. What we're presenting is baseline for everyone. We're not necessarily saying to each country that you need to prioritize, and we're not necessarily unfairly painting red, but for overall performance, this is where you are. So it helps you to prioritize going forward. After you've prioritized, then you perhaps may not necessarily want to focus on this particular goal, but you want to focus on another goal. So it's just to give every country a baseline idea of what their overall performance is. But once you've begun to prioritize and implement your stuff, then you'll be able to report according to those goals that you've prioritized for. The other question would have been comparability across countries. We tried to use the most recent data set. So if we're using 2016 data sets, it would have meant that any country that is included, we would have had the same identical data set as much as possible for those particular countries. But there is always the question of how robust is the data set that you're using, you know, what are your quality assurances and stuff. So what the SDSN have done is pull data sets from international organizations through which countries would have had to report. So would have pulled from the UNICEF for education, would have pulled from WHO, IMF and stuff. So we're pulling from those. But as you've pointed out, as well as the Jamaican lady across there, is that as we work through, there are many issues that we're going to have to deal with. We're going to fine-tune the program. It's going to be improved upon. So there are many other issues that are going to be improved upon. So thank you for your suggestions. And going forward, there's stuff that we really need to consider. And like you said, explain when we're indeed presenting the dashboard.
Just follow up on the question regarding the matter of countries prioritizing their own, basically trying to find a balance between individual country priorities and what is outlined by the SDGs. Well, first of all, the indicators and dashboard were developed as a common method of trying to compare countries and to raise awareness about these indicators. So they will never be perfect for all country situations at all times. The idea is really to just have an objective means of comparing countries and allowing individual countries to aspire to perform better towards the SDGs. But we recognize, I mean, of course it's recognized that at any one point in time, individual countries' aspirations and goals and the way they prioritize them might not line up perfectly with the way the SDGs have been developed. And to this end, it's worth pointing out that a part of this exercise that Natanya did for Capri together with SDSN and ISD was to evaluate the possibility of developing a regional dashboard. So looking, if we could go one step further from the broader SDGs and the dashboard to considering whether a regional dashboard could be developed for SIDS because of our particular situation and the indicators amongst that set of 63 or more indicators that would be more relevant to small island developing states. And maybe, Natanya, you can speak a little bit.
What I'm going to do is I'm going to ask, I know because we're running now out of time, what I want to do is give the opportunity to people in the floor if there are further questions. I know there's one over here, and then there's one over there. And we would have time, I guess, for one more question after those two. So, go ahead. Yeah, I think.
And basically, what is CARICOM definition of sustainable development?
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Yes.
Thank you. I think my questions are going to be a bit easier. My name is Serge Captain with UNDP in New York in the Policy Bureau. I have one question first, which is it possible to have the list of the 109 CARICOM indicators? That's going to help inform the support that we provide in the context of the MAPS missions as well. And the next one is just a quick comment regarding the use of data that's already exists. I think that I would suggest maybe in the proceedings of the conference, I would consider the possibility that CARICOM countries in the Caribbean participate more in the Open Government Partnership, because that provides a framework and maybe an incentive for governments to open up their data sets. And now how to get that data more used, one suggestion, learning from the experience in the African region, for example, is that there are frameworks of collaboration that exist between UNDP, for instance, because I'm from UNDP, and the private sector to encourage the use of data. So there's a framework agreement already with the Association of Mobile Providers to make their data available. And then there are hackathon competitions, data hackathons. I wonder if that could not be a suggestion here, because there's a lot of energy and creativity among young people in using new tools. So maybe a collaboration between the statistical offices, we, to make that data available to young data scientists and ask them to find some creative uses for it. I think that's there's a lot of energy around that in other regions, okay, and I think there's a lot of capacity here and a lot of potential for a similar kind of energy around data use.
Thanks very much. And the final question.
Yes, good morning. Thank you very much, ladies, for your presentations. I found them the most useful and valuable so far during these 3 days. My question particularly pertains to the SDSN dashboard. And I was wondering, I know that this was an initial project, and so you access surveys and data already produced by international organizations, but I was wondering if this is not a great opportunity to harmonize some regional measuring tools so that when you measure the goals across the countries, that you will be measuring the same thing. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I'm going to ask the panel to respond. There was a question with regard to CARICOM and CARIForum, and then questions with regard to open government and also, well, the last question, which, so, Amrita?
Now, I am not a trade expert. I'm a humble zoologist, but I will try. I will try. I think what would be helpful is if you all could see a day in the life of a Caribbean technical person, because the same people who sat down and agreed to the SDGs were the people who went into the negotiations on the EPA. So, you know, from that, so there will not be that level of divergence. And remember, the EPA was designed to advance sustainable development. Now, the question of what is the definition of sustainable development, I don't want to, you know, I mean, there is the Brundtland definition that every sustainable development student knows, but I argue, I even have this argument with people in the Secretariat. Our definition for sustainable development is captured in the Treaty of Chaguaramas. That was 1973, long before 1992. It's there. What our vision for sustainable development is there for every single CARICOM national to see. And what I'm trying to get them to understand as well, I'm trying to convince the Secretariat, is all of your work is sustainable development. You know, what we tend to do is we tend to assign an owner because you need someone to do the work. But the benefit of this SDG, I think the biggest benefit to this region is that it's going to force us to stop working in silos. and start to work more closely together. We have to be integrated, and we have to see how each of us advances the agenda. It's not in the desk of an officer designated Sustainable Development Officer or a ministry designated Ministry of Sustainable Development. The other thing about, I wanted to make a point about statistical offices, and it also has to do with the legal mandate. Now, when I was a practitioner at the national level, I used to argue with my colleagues in environment that the one entity with an act, a legal act, to produce and disseminate statistics on behalf of your government is the statistical department. So, you know, the thrust then became, we should fit our data. Yes, we are the experts. Yes, it's a very technical area, and it's different methodologies, and it's different ways of collection, but it has to fit into what the government has designated as the authority to disseminate information on its behalf. And many of us had sat in meetings and have seen figures for our country that we're like, where did they get this from? You know, so that is why I think we're trying to stress the importance of national statistical offices. I don't know if I handled all. Sorry, yeah.
You can
yeah.
sort of wind up. Or no, okay, thank you. Very short comment by Netanya. I'm aware of the fact that we've already gone over time on this session.
I just want to point out that for the 2016 report, we used 63 indicators, but for the 2017 report, we used 77 indicators. So this is just to show you that as we go through the process, we're fine-tuning and we're improving the tool that we're doing. But like Dr. Shaw also pointed out, one of the purposes of doing this is at the global level, it's like a one-size-fits-all perspective, and we don't want that. So what we're proposing, like you've suggested, is regional measuring tools, but also a regional indicator and dashboard for the Caribbean SIDS. So this will include our region-specific indicators, and if it is that there are new indicators that are not currently captured, that's more unique to our situations. Like I alluded to earlier, that the SDGs don't currently look at lifestyle illnesses. It doesn't necessarily capture crime at the level that it is affecting us. It doesn't necessarily drill down into tourism and all those other unique situations within the Caribbean. So we're trying to propose a Caribbean region-specific dashboard that will include and measure our indicators that we think are pertinent to us within our region.
Thank you very much. I'd like us to give the panel a big hand. I just want to thank the panel, just noting that some of the points that were made, not everything was addressed, but we take into account things like, for example, colonial history. We're very happy to hear the invitation from Planning Institute to sit down with them and explain further how we can move forward. And I want to just thank the ministers, the heads of delegation, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for coming. Thank you for listening. Thank you for your enthusiastic response. And remember that the next time you see us knocking on your door asking questions, now you'll know why it is that we're knocking on your door asking questions. Thank you very much. I believe the next session will start at 11 o'clock.